Thank you for joining me in this series. Years before the U.S. began its escalating military entanglement in Vietnam, U.S. military and civilian forces were engaged against communist forces in a much smaller, severely underdeveloped neighboring country of which few Americans had heard. Wedged between Vietnam and Thailand, the Kingdom of Laos had historically been a pawn between the two warring states. There is much we don't know about the secret war today because the U.S. government kept the war secret, even compartmentalizing it among the participants. In retrospect, Laos seems one of the last places on earth the U.S. would want to take a major military or ideological stand against communism, committing almost unending resources. In the late 1950s, the estimated mixed ethnic Lao population was around 2 million, although no one was quite sure. The average Lao lifespan was under 40 years, and 80 to 90% of the people were functionally illiterate, the highest illiteracy rate in Southeast Asia. There were no colleges or universities and only one high school. The ethnic Lao only made up less than half of the population, and the elite of these were a collection of rival clans who shared little sense of national interest and viewed the national government as a tool for power and influence. Yet prior to the conflict in Vietnam, U.S. policymakers saw cloistered Laos, a nation slightly smaller than Oregon and far removed from 20th century development, as a primary location to confront communism. So what was the U.S. secret war in Laos about, and how did we get there? The Lao War has to be understood in terms of the Vietnam War because both conflicts were essentially one big common war, although the U.S. prosecuted the wars differently, a mistake. The wars were common in that the communist North Vietnamese were asserting their hegemony over both South Vietnam and Laos, and the U.S. was opposing those actions. The U.S. began heavily investing in Laos in 1955, but we will date the war to 1959. That was the year the North Vietnamese declared armed struggle to unite North and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese invaded Laos that year, as it had in 1953. And in 1959, the U.S. inserted Army Special Forces teams into Laos to begin training Hmong and Lao indigenous forces to resist communist advances. This Special Forces operation was later named White Star, or the more benign Lao Training Advisory Group. White Star had Thai interpreters, one here such as Sawat Songlen. Big Mo was his call sign, and he is still going strong in Thailand. The U.S. goal in Laos ultimately was to unify all non-communist political groups and to strengthen them militarily and economically to the point where Laos would become a firm anti-communist bastion on the borders of China and Vietnam. Particularly the Eisenhower administration believed Laos potentially was a spearhead for advancing communism throughout Southeast Asia. The origins of both the Vietnam and Laos Secret War really began immediately after World War II when the French reasserted their claim over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, countries the French had colonized the previous century. The Japanese and World War II had forced the French from these countries, and now the French wanted the territory back. Resistance to the French began building, conflict ensued, and in 1954, the Communist Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese, defeated the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This war between the French and Viet Minh, beginning after World War II and ending in 1954, is called the First Indochina War. The 1954 Geneva Peace Conference followed the war, and Vietnam was divided into the Communist North and non-Communist South Vietnam. Nationwide elections were supposed to occur in 1956 to reunite the country, but that didn't happen. North Vietnam committed to war in 1959 to seize South Vietnam. That year, the North Vietnamese also began constructing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, running through Laos as an invasion route into South Vietnam. The existence of this invasion route in Laos and the role it played in the Vietnam War is a primary reason why the U.S. escalated its involvement in Laos. The North Vietnamese used this network to ferry North Vietnamese fighters and logistics into Vietnam to topple Saigon. Therefore, I want to briefly explain this immense road network and the role it plays in this story. The trail started in North Vietnam and ran the length of Laos with entry points into South Vietnam. The main route eventually stretched 625 miles, feeding 12,500 miles of arterial roads. By the late 1960s, the North Vietnamese had laid 3,000 miles of pipeline to keep trucks and tanks supplied with fuel. 15,000 transport trucks delivered troops and supplies to the south. By the war's end, the North Vietnamese claimed 2 million of their personnel had used the trail, and they had transported 45 million tons of war material along its length. Now, the day before John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, President Eisenhower told Kennedy, according to the records of the meeting, that Laos was the key to Southeast Asia to prevent a communist takeover of that region. Communist and anti-communist forces in Laos had been bickering and fighting since 1954, and a communist takeover in Laos would threaten the entire region. Here was the situation in Laos at that point. The communist forces on the ground were Pathet Lao, the indigenous communist Lao group, and their sponsors, the North Vietnamese, or Viet Minh. Backing their efforts were the Soviets and the People's Republic of China. The communists were warring against the Royal Lao government, which had a king and a parliament, was pro-French, and was supported by the U.S., Thailand, and a vehemently anti-North Vietnamese indigenous group, the Hmong. Thailand had special operations forces operating inside Laos in the 1950s called the Police Aerial Reconnaissance Units, or PARU. A young CIA operative in Thailand named Bill Lair, beginning in 1951, had built the PARU. The PARU later took on an expanded role in Laos, training Royal Lao, Hmong, and other Lao soldiers in combat operations, as well as other minority groups. Why would the U.S. government keep the war in Laos a secret? Certainly the U.S. effort in neighboring Vietnam was not secret. Well, it stemmed from that 1954 Geneva Agreement, which we talked about earlier, that divided North and South Vietnam after the French defeat. Strangely, the U.S. and South Vietnam refused to sign the 1954 agreement, but the U.S. said it would abide by it. The conference was an effort to resolve several problems in Asia. It resulted in the division of Vietnam, the sovereignty of Laos and South Asia from the French, and the neutrality of Laos. Laos was not to pursue aggression, nor were foreign armies to use Laos for foreign aggression. So the U.S. did not want it to be known that it was violating the treaty, and took great pains to hide its combat involvement in assisting the Royal Lao government against the communists, who seemed to take little pains in hiding their aggressive war effort. But the 1954 agreement really solved nothing, and the bickering factions in Laos continued sniping at the other. One of the U.S. government's first considerations for creating an armed indigenous anti-communist force in Laos came in May 1955, when Hmong leaders told U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Charles Yost, that their partisans previously allied with the French would be willing to participate in guerrilla action. Lao royalists also advocated this action, viewing it as an effective way to fight the Pathet Lao. Let me interrupt for a moment. How many of you are familiar with Sunisa Lee, the American who just won a gold medal at the Tokyo Olympics? Her odyssey to the gold medal all begins with this moment in 1955. I'll tie it all together. In April 1956, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. Ambassador to Laos, J. Graham Parsons, recommended that the CIA operations in Laos be expanded to permit the additional arming of the Lao Defense Forces. The CIA operation in Laos would become the agency's largest paramilitary operation in CIA history. Enter the Hmong leader, Vang Pao, who would lead the Hmong in an anti-Vietnamese and Pathet Lao resistance as a U.S. ally. The French had first armed the Hmong as allies with crude weapons to regain control of Laos at the end of World War II. The French had discovered Vang Pao in 1947, recognizing his talent and developing him as a leader. first as a sergeant, then as an officer. He fought with them against the North Vietnamese in the First Indochina War, and before that, Vong Pao was an emissary from the Hmong resistance to the Japanese. Vong Pao became the first Hmong officer in the Royal Lao Armed Forces, and in 1965 was appointed the Lao Army's military commander for Military Region 2, the Plain of Jars area, which is now a World Heritage Site, a small 500 square mile area on the Jinquan Plain of Laos. Vong Pao was a gifted, forceful, charismatic leader who worked alongside the U.S. and Thai, but often called the shots in how to prosecute the ground war. The first CIA contact with Vong Pao was in December 1958, when a French army officer introduced CIA operative Jack Matthews to Vong Pao. The CIA intent during this period was only to arm and train the Hmong to defend themselves in their territory against the North Vietnamese, who had already displaced the Hmong from their home areas. The Hmong were anti-Vietnamese long before the U.S. arrived due to previous Vietnamese encroachments upon their way of life. This is a point I want you to remember. The original U.S. mission was just to provide a military capability to the Hmong for them to defend themselves. In 1959, the U.S. Army Special Forces began training the Hmong force in Laos as guerrillas, but were not arming or supplying them initially. That year, Vong Pao asked Stu Methven, a CIA paramilitary officer who followed Matthews, for logistical support, to which the CIA agreed. At the same time, unbeknownst to the U.S. State or Departments of Defense, the CIA was also arming a bright young Royal Lao Army paratroop captain, Cong Le. By 1960, the U.S. Defense Department also began arming Cong Le's unit. As a result of this formal supply and training relationship with the CIA, Vong Pao, with Air America support, relocated 200 or so Hmong villages to safe havens ringing the Plain of Jars, established a military headquarters 6 miles south of there, and the CIA, Thai Peru units, and U.S. Army Special Forces under the White Star program began an official expanded training program. Air America was delivering food and supplies to the Hmong. In 1961, Bill Lair became the CIA officer supporting Vong Pao and was responsible for most of the heavy lifting to assist the Hmong up until the latter 1960s. The CIA became the sole U.S. agency responsible for managing the Hmong at this point. Air America was a passenger and cargo airline established in 1956, owned by the CIA, so it flew missions in Laos, Vietnam, and other areas supporting U.S. operations. Air America's mission included rice drops and other logistical support to U.S. allies and rescuing down U.S. pilots. Other CIA-affiliated airlines that were just as important were Civil Air Transport, or CAT, Continental Air Services, a subsidiary of Continental Airlines, and Bird & Sons. Continental Air Services was owned by Bob Six and his wife Audrey Meadows, who played the wife of Jackie Gleason in the popular American TV series The Honeymooners. Air America, with its civilian pilots, conducted many U.S. Air Force and Navy pilot rescues in Laos because the U.S. Air Force and Navy had laborious rules of engagement and flight procedures, reducing nimbleness and quick action. Air America pilots were really good, knew what they were doing, and willing to put their lives on the line to rescue people. Several U.S. military pilots were shot down over Laos. Some killed, some escaped, many still missing in action. In April 1960, elections were held in Laos, and the Royal Lao Army, with CIA assistance, shamelessly stole the election. Not a single Pathet Lao delegate was elected. A right-wing pro-U.S. government was formed, and a reaction occurred. In August 1960, Cong Le, who I mentioned earlier, staged a surprise and largely bloodless coup in the Lao capital without American knowledge to overthrow the U.S. and Thai-sponsored government. From this moment on, Laos would not be the same. This incident sparked violence and combat that continued through 1975. Kong Le was naive and wanted a neutralist government, saying factionalism was destroying the country. His military was referred to as neutralist forces, yet he soon surrounded himself with Pathet Lao. The U.S. and Thai sprang into action. In Bangkok, Thai military and CIA leaders formed a Thai military headquarters that would command, control, and coordinate a counter-coup by a Lao rightist general. Kong Le soon relinquished administrative operations to a coalition government while maintaining his forces in the city, but it was too late. In December, Kong Le and his forces were violently driven from the city by the U.S. and Thai-supported right-wing forces. The irony is that the U.S. State Department officially supported the coalition government that the Americans and Thai had now overthrown. Kong Le fled the capital with his forces to the Plain of Jars area to join communist forces, supported by a Soviet resupply airlift. The Soviets later stated that other than World War II, their air support to Kong Le was the highest priority Soviet supply operation since the Bolshevik Revolution. Several weeks later, in January 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated president and found himself with this civil war between communist and non-communist factions inside Laos. The North Vietnamese also invaded Laos and was providing advisors to the Pathet Lao. In April, Vong Vieng, a prolific backpacker party town featured in Western travel guides, fell to the communists. The North Vietnamese swept south towards the Mekong River and Thailand, forcing the Thai to deploy a small military force to Phuket, Laos, to save the town as it occupied a strategic position. President Kennedy ordered secret U.S. airstrikes against the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao from Thailand using unmarked aircraft in Operation Mill Pond. Mill Pond was to occur the same week as the Bay of Pigs operation into Cuba, which was mid-April 1961. However, in the wake of scaling back aircraft support for the Bay of Pigs operations, Kennedy also halted the Mill Pond strikes. Listen to what President Kennedy said about Laos on March 23, 1961 in a press conference.
I want to make a brief statement about Laos. It is, I think, important for all Americans to understand this difficult and potentially dangerous problem. In my last conversation with General Eisenhower, the day before the inauguration on January 19th, we spent more time on this hard matter than on any other thing. And since then, it has been steadily before the administration as the most immediate of the problems that we found.
Note, Kennedy said he and Eisenhower spent more time discussing Laos than any other matter, and Laos was the most immediate problem upon taking office. Not wanting a war, U.S. policy took a sharp turn away from the goal of a strong anti-communist Laos towards the concept of a Laos that would be neutralized, policed by international agreement, and governed by a coalition of right-wing, neutralist, and communist forces. The U.S. participated in yet another peace conference, which began in Geneva, May 1961. The goal of the Kennedy administration was just to avoid war. Frankly, the Soviets had no appetite for war either. The U.S. had already placed advisors in South Vietnam, and that conflict was Kennedy's focus. Although there was officially a ceasefire in Laos during the year-long Geneva Conference proceedings, hostilities continued and the North Vietnamese conducted an offensive in southern Laos before the agreement signing, capturing the key village of Chapon and securing critical terrain necessary to facilitate their use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This conference would last until July 1962, and the result would be the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. The agreement prohibited interference, direct or indirect, in the internal affairs of Laos, and to refrain from drawing Laos into military alliance or to establish military bases in Lao territory. This second Geneva Agreement was also a reason U.S. policymakers wanted to keep the war in Laos a secret. After the 1962 agreement, the U.S. pulled its Army Special Forces from Laos under Operation White Star, I mentioned earlier. The North Vietnamese instead kept 7,000 to 9,000 troops there in violation of the agreement and continued to expand the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the eastern part of Laos. The Communist Viet Minh was determined to assert hegemony over Laos. The United States and Soviets still desired to avoid a full-scale war in Laos like that brewing in Vietnam, so the major powers preferred to keep their operations in Laos secret to avoid inflaming tensions and creating unnecessary escalations. In a tense stalemate, the U.S. largely acceded to the North Vietnamese, the eastern part of Laos. The steadfast U.S. ally, Thailand, greatly objected to the 1962 Geneva Agreement because one of the conditions to which the U.S. acquiesced was a coalition government which included communists. This before the U.S. pulled its troops from the country, leaving Thailand vulnerable. This facade of an arrangement brought about a feeble, weak Lao government. So with the North Vietnamese occupying the eastern half of Laos, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail as an invasion route into South Vietnam, the U.S., within a short period of time, decided it could no longer turn a blind eye to events in Laos, deciding to escalate operations. So this setting became the template for how the war would be fought for the next decade. That is, a secret war hidden from the American public. Since the U.S. did not introduce ground combat troops into Laos, the U.S. relied upon air power and ended up dropping more bombs on Laos than it did on Germany and Japan during World War II. The ground combatants? American allies, the Lao, Hmong, other Lao minorities, and Thai. Directing these ground operations were CIA paramilitary operatives, although Hmong leader Vong Pao often called the shots on the ground and the U.S. followed. The overall military commander? The U.S. ambassador to Laos. There were other strange anomalies regarding the Lao War. It was the only country in the world in which the U.S. funded 100% of its defense budget and almost all of its economy, and probably the only instance in history where a nation that was attacked, the Royal Lao, maintained relations with the attacking government, the aggressor, the North Vietnamese. As you can see, Laos was a very complex situation. So just to recap what we talked about here. 1. Two Geneva agreements, one in 1954 and the other 1962, were designed to keep Laos neutral, but the North Vietnamese did not remove ground troops after the 62 agreement as the U.S. did, and continued aggressive, threatening actions against the Royal Lao government with its partner, the Pathet Lao. 2. In 1959, the U.S. inserted Army Special Forces into Laos to begin training Royal Lao Army soldiers, the Hmong, and other ethnic groups. 3. Upon taking office in 1961, Kennedy stated Laos was the most pressing problem as he entered office, as communist advances in the country and civil war threatened the Royal Lao government. And 5. Both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations believed this communist movement was a spearhead that would lead to a domino effect of toppling other nations in the region, to include the staunch U.S. ally, Thailand. With this backdrop of the war and context in mind, I will now walk you through U.S. operations in the war in Session 2. Thank you. Thank you for joining me for Session 2 on the Secret War in Laos. In the last session, I provided you the background and the context of the war. I will now walk you through U.S. operations. I will do that by showing you the 5 methods by which the U.S. conducted the war. Before I do, I suspect there are some things from Session 1 that you are questioning. First, why was it that if the North Vietnamese were so openly violating the Geneva Agreements by keeping combat troops in Laos and expanding the Ho Chi Minh Trail to invade South Vietnam, that U.S. officials were so intent on keeping U.S. actions in Laos secret? Well, it is indeed perplexing. I highly recommend Norman B. Hanna's book, as he goes into much more detail as to why the U.S. willfully and ignorantly ignored this breach. I do want to quote him briefly. Hanna says that American policymakers suffer from a malady which he calls the, quote, victorious truth syndrome, unquote. This syndrome has a core belief which he calls the self-enforceability of truth. This self-enforceability of truth myth holds that if the bad guy's behavior is exposed, then somehow the glare of world opinion will wither the bad guys while illuminating the U.S. He says it is a naive concept, as if the bad guys are bound by the glare of world opinion, held down by the arrows of truth. This naive assumption drove U.S. policymakers in the mid-1960s. Ambassador Leonard Unger felt the Soviets could be embarrassed by what was happening in Laos. This was a very naive belief, and since this exposure didn't work, and the Vietnamese continued to weaponize Laos in their conquest of South Vietnam, the U.S. conducted a secret air war in Laos instead. Now I want to make a second point about Vietnam before we talk about Laos operations, because the two countries were so intricately linked. What you have learned about the Vietnam War is wrong. You have been taught that the war in South Vietnam was an indigenous insurgency, that it was a civil war, that it was a guerrilla war. How did the Saigon government fall in 1975? Was it an implosion? Was it an indigenous insurgency that overthrew the government? No. The Saigon government fell in 1975 through a conventional North Vietnamese invasion with tanks, artillery, aircraft, anti-tank missiles, anti-tank systems, anti-aircraft systems. It was a conventional force invasion. In fact, it took the North Vietnamese 5 conventional force invasions. These conventional force invasions from the north was a North Vietnamese officer who served on the general staff of North Vietnam's army and received the unconditional surrender of South Vietnam on April 30, 1975. He later became editor of the Vietnamese communist paper People's Daily, the official newspaper of Vietnam. He later became disillusioned with the Vietnamese Communist Party and moved to Paris, where he died. In a Los Angeles Times interview in 1995, Bui Tin was asked, "How could the Americans have won the war?" He replied, "Cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside Laos. If Johnson had granted Westmoreland's request to enter Laos and block the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Hanoi could not have won the war." U.S. officials knew in the 1960s how and to what extent the North Vietnamese were using the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos to invade South Vietnam. That's why the U.S. made Laos the most heavily bombed country on the earth. U.S. officials were willing to send young Americans to die in a foreign war, but these same officials never had the stomach to admit the U.S. would violate a treaty. Also, in prosecuting the war, it would have made sense for the U.S. to create a unified task force that had purview over military operations in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, as it was one common war, fought against a common enemy, a common mission, deter communism. Instead, the U.S. conducted 3 separate operations, 2 with ambassadors in charge, which created inefficiencies, provided cumbersome coordinations, competing priorities, resource misallocation, and thus severe handicaps in prosecuting the common war. The U.S. effort in Laos began to take shape when in 1955 the U.S. established the U.S. Operations Mission, Laos. It had 2 functions. 1, a thinly disguised military aid program, and 2, a humanitarian and development mission through the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Conducting the war started in Vientiane, where every morning for 1 to 2 hours the U.S. ambassador to Laos assembled a country team with which he met daily that included his State Department staff, military advisors, Army and Air Force attachés, USAID, CIA, and other elements that were engaged in activities to assist Laos. The meeting discussed the day's operations, at which time the ambassador often even approved the type of military ordnance to use. One participant stated, quote, "For an hour or so you would have the charts on the wall, the military maps and everything. It was all 99.9% military." The U.S. prosecution of the Lao War largely consisted of 5 methods, and I'm going to break down these methods and explain the war to you. The first method was the training and equipping inside Laos of the Hmong and other ethnic minorities and Royal Lao forces to fight the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese. Thai Peru were the primary trainers in this effort. CIA officers were advisors and sometimes played a role as commander on the ground. Later in the war, the Thai deployed almost 17,000 troops to fight the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao inside Laos, which we will discuss. The second method, occurring simultaneously, was USAID, Community Development and Refugee Relief. By the latter 1960s, USAID was feeding 300,000 Lao, all staples delivered by the U.S. Civilian Air Services, all done in the midst of a shooting war. USAID in Laos assisted the Lao with everything from farming to hygiene education, rural schools, medical services, technical training, and refugee relief. The third method, which began to escalate in 1964 and 1965, was the air war, bombing North Vietnamese formations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and providing close air support to Allied ground forces engaged in battle. Most of the flights targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail originated from Thailand. There were 7 Royal Thai Air Force bases inside Thailand with American forces. At the height of the war, the U.S. Air Force had about 55,000 airmen inside Thailand. The U.S. used other bases in Laos and a naval fleet in Guam. Fourth, there was a large training effort of Lao soldiers inside Laos and inside Thailand, from technical training to pilot training to infantry training.
Trained to fly in Thailand by a select group of American instructor pilots, these Hmong pilots returned to Laos and flew fearlessly, relentlessly, and with such skill that they became combat pilot legends, even to their American counterparts.
Who are these guys? They fly 8, 9, 10 missions a day. That's impossible.
Each one of us that ended up at UNORN were all instructors before. We had instructed various national pilots from around the world. We'd had Vietnamese, we'd had Iranians, Saudis, a lot of South Americans, stuff like that.
The Hmong were by far the most dedicated of all. They worked the hardest, and it meant the most to them to accomplish their goal of being a pilot.
They were the most dedicated and skillful people that I think any of us ever saw.
They are capable and they are the best.
When I was assigned to YA and we started flying together, I knew a potential pilot when I saw one. And this guy had all the indicators. Sharp, smart, fast learner, highly, highly, highly committed. These guys were going to be flying life and death combat. Within months after I started flying with him. And it really hit me hard that the best way that I could possibly teach all of them, not just YA, was to take my hands and feet off the controls.
Finally, later in the war, there were secret U.S. Special Operations raids into Laos by the Special Operations Group, or SOG. But these had limited effect because by this time the war had grown so large, such special operations raids and ambushes yielded inconsequential strategic results. Of these 5 methods, we will focus on the 3 that exerted the most U.S. effort, time, energy, and money. These would be the equipping and training of the Hmong forces and other minority groups, next the community aid and health programs, and finally the air war. Let's begin with the paramilitary and development aid programs because these occurred early, starting in the late 1950s and early 1960s. As I stated earlier, senior Thai military and CIA officials formed a military headquarters for the command and control of a counter-coup against Kong Le in 1960. From that effort came the creation of an ultra-secret military headquarters in Thailand called Unit, or later Combined Headquarters 333, made up of Thai military and CIA officials who organized war efforts in Laos. Although the U.S. ambassador to Laos officially ran the war for the U.S., as the war grew, Headquarters 333 oversaw much of the daily ground operations and execution of the war, as the Thai forces, which played such a large role, fell under this task force and not under the U.S. ambassador. Also, much of the U.S. funding for the war that was paid to the Thai went to them through Unit 333. I obtained this probably 1962 photo showing the initial meeting for the formation of this headquarters. On the left is Lao Prime Minister Suvarnabhumi. Foreground is probably U.S. Army Colonel Arthur Simmons, the last commander of the White Star teams. Next is Thai Army Colonel Suthait, who was the operations officer and second in command of the Thai task force inside Laos throughout the duration of the war, and his aide. CIA officials to the right are not shown. Suthait's son, who also became a Thai general, provided me the picture, saying his father prized the photo as the formation of the joint U.S.-Thai effort. Task Force 333 and the Laos CIA operations, initially headquartered in Vientiane, but with the signing of the Geneva Agreement, eventually landed just off base from Udon Thani Royal Thai Air Force Base, while the CIA and Air America were headquartered on the base. The CIA also rented several apartments in the top floor of the Sharon Hotel in Udon Thani in the mid-1960s. The CIA officers running the Lao War from Thailand were Bill Lair and Pat Landry. I mentioned earlier that the CIA and Air America relocated Vang Pao and his Hmong to the Plain of Jars. Initially at Padong, Laos, it soon moved a few kilometers west to the valley of the Long Chain. There were less than 14 Lao in the valley when the Hmong moved in. By 1970, this top-secret base for the Hmong, Thai, and CIA would be the second largest city in Laos with about 45,000 people, and, based upon takeoffs and landings, the busiest airport in the world. Some have referred to it as the most secret place on Earth.
At the height of the secret war, the CIA base at Long Chen reportedly had one of the busiest airports in the world. Hmong, Lao, and CIA pilots flew thousands of dangerous rescue and ground support missions.
Longchain, Lao, the Hmong base and Forward 333 and CIA base, received its share of visitors over the years. Almost certainly on the same trip where Richard Colby visited 333 headquarters in Udon, here he and Vientiane CIA Station Chief Doug Blawford are seen at Longchain. Colby at the time was Chief, Far East Division, Directorate of Plans for the CIA and later CIA Director. The Thai maintained a large Army and Air Force presence at Longchain, and here in 1971 is visiting Thai Army Chief of Staff General Sirikat Mayalarp shaking hands with the Longchain Thai second in command Colonel Don, while Vang Pao shakes hands with probably Sirikat's deputy. To the right is CIA officer Robert Burr Smith. Burr in World War II was in the 101st Airborne 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, Company E, the unit featured in the famous series Band of Brothers. Here is a picture showing a later meeting of Sirikit, Colonel Don, and Vang Pao, and others, and then their departure on an Air America helicopter, probably to inspect Thai Army outposts, with their almost 17,000 Thai soldiers in Laos. Here is Raven 27, Craig During, and I in 2015, overlooking Long Cheng Valley, my first of several trips there. As we look at the still standing old CIA building, the old Raven barracks under the watchful eye of the government, Craig's wife Terry and I had to pretend to be taking nondescript pics because the communist Lao government is still very sensitive about this area. And as you see, here is Vang Pao's old house, one of two that he had in Long Cheng. The CIA had left 2 officers in Laos when the U.S. pulled military forces out in 1962, Tony Poshepny and Vint Lawrence. Poe was a hard-drinking ex-Marine who joined the Marines at age 16, became a sapper, and fought in the South Pacific in a unit that took over 75% casualties. He then fought in Korea, Malaya, Indonesia, and the Philippines as a CIA paramilitary officer. Lawrence, a Connecticut native who graduated from Princeton University with an art history degree, was 22 years old when he arrived in Laos. Under President Kennedy, the CIA began to increase the number of Hmong guerrilla fighters. A White House memorandum from July 1961 stated that the paramilitary capability in Laos consisted of 99 Thai Peru personnel arrayed in 13 teams, a 300-man Thai Special Police Unit, a force to be increased to 500 Thai, with 2 CIA advisors. 9 CIA officers and 9 Special Forces officers were assisting the Hmong, with 2 CIA officers for backup in Vientiane. 9,000 Hmong had been trained to that point, and in August, Kennedy approved the support of 2,000 more, for the total of 11,000. The CIA also created other military units from the Lao minority tribal groups called Special Guerrilla Units, or SGUs. The strength of the SGUs overall was 30,000 or more by the late 1960s. These units fought and suffered just as much as the Hmong. So the friendly force structure was the Royal Lao Military, probably 50 to 60,000 personnel. No one really knows. Many of the roles were padded. Then the irregular force structures of Hmong and Lao into special guerrilla units, probably 30 to 40,000 personnel, with roles padded as well. Next, the U.S. and Lao began to build remote airstrips, called LS or L sites, Lima sites, throughout the country for the U.S. to provide aid, medicine, and hard rice, or arms, to tribal groups, and conduct refugee relief. These Lima sites were often outposts for U.S. aid workers and CIA officers. Laos is an extremely mountainous country, absent good roads, and air was the only way to travel. Air America and the other CIA contracted airlines use short takeoff and landing propeller-driven planes, such as C-123s, Caribous, Pilatus Porters, Helio Couriers, and old Marine H-34 helicopters. Flying was a hazard in Laos due to the inhospitable forest-covered mountains, changing, unpredictable weather patterns from valley to valley, and enemy anti-aircraft fire. American civilians, CIA officers, and soldiers lost lives due to air crashes, and in some cases search and rescue missions never found a trace of survivors or wreckage due to the jagged, inhospitable terrain. Other U.S. pilots and crew met a bad fate due to airstrips being overrun by the enemy. Before pilots would land, they would look for a unique code laid out next to the airstrip saying it was safe to land. Miscommunication arising from these codes occasionally meant pilots were imperiled upon arrival or planes shot up. By the end of the war in Laos, over 400 of these sites had been established. Not all of the sites built were used throughout the war. Many were overrun by enemy forces and could no longer be accessed. Others were abandoned once refugees evacuated an area or as Hmong and Lao forces no longer needed the area for combat operations. Bad weather sometimes eroded a landing site, making it unusable. On the aid front, USAID provided rural aid development throughout Laos through community development work in villages and refugee relief, which was a mobile enterprise as refugees moved based upon the exigencies of war. One of the more colorful characters of the war was a humanitarian aid supervisor who was in charge of aid operations in remote northern Laos named Edgar Pop Buell. Pop had been a rural farmer in Steuben County, Indiana, but following the death of his wife, Buell, at the age of 47, arrived in Laos in 1960 as an agricultural advisor, his first time ever out of the U.S. Working without electricity or running water, he gave his life for the Lao, Hmong, and others, sometimes buying supplies for people from his retirement fund. Although Pop was uneducated, he learned the Hmong language and was well respected by each American ambassador in Laos. He was forced to flee Laos in 1975 when the communist Pathet Lao gained control of the country and he was on the Pathet Lao hit list. My friend, Continental pilot Les Strauss, flew him out, disguised as a pilot. In 1967, famous American author John Steinbeck was said to have remarked during a visit to Laos, quote, "I think Pop is an example of how the ancient gods were born. Whether you believe it or not, there are still giants on the earth," unquote.
In Vientiane, 1,500 tons of rice each month are loaded into old cargo planes of contract airlines. It is the difference between staying or running for 120,000 refugees. A prearranged signal is put out, or all the villages look alike. It tells the pilot the village is still in friendly hands. It may be the oldest established permanent flying propaganda game in Asia, but in this war, what falls from an airplane is as important as what grows from the muzzle of a gun. Refugees have come to the village. They come in families and in small groups. Each year, 50,000 people come to hundreds of villages like this. They come with nothing. They could not wait for the resistance to come to them. The men of the village have been armed for several years now. Some, mostly the old men and old leaders, have succumbed to age, opium, and whiskey. They continue to fight as they always fought, only as individuals, only when needed. They are the home guard.
On the health front, the U.S. administered medical care and trained over 1,000 medical corpsmen and practical nurses to work in tribal villages, especially among refugees. The upcountry U.S. aid effort, closely connected with the refugee relief effort, was headquartered at Sam Tong near Longcheng, with a 200-bed hospital and logistical site. Teenage Hmong and Lao girls were trained as nurses at Sam Tong by the healthcare personnel with American and Lao medical doctors, which created some social upheaval in these primitive societies by young women leaving their villages to become professionally trained. U.S. Air Force commando doctors also operated at Sam Tong and other sites. The Filipinos also had Operation Brotherhood in Laos, an assistance program of Filipino doctors, nurses, nutritionists, and social workers who provided relief through 3 hospitals, as well as community development projects, to more than 1 million Lao. This operation also ran a nursing school in Vientiane. Numerous primitive dispensaries were built and were operating in 125 localities as of May 1970. An American husband and wife medical team Dr. Charles Weldon and his wife, Dr. Patricia McReady, made a significant contribution to public health in Laos. Their life mission was to deliver health care to the less fortunate. When they arrived in Laos in 1963 as USAID physicians, there were only 7 Lao physicians in the country, so they focused on developing medical and public health education. In particular, the program with the Hmong nurses made a tremendous difference in the conflict areas. Charles was the chief of USAID Public Health Assistance Program in Laos. They became heroes in the Lao War, risking their lives to travel throughout the country on Air America and other airplanes and helicopters, dispensing medical aid to refugees, soldiers, and their families, evading communist ambushes and anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the war, the U.S. was supporting hundreds of thousands of Lao civilians, and Lao war refugees migrated to flee the Vietnamese. American missionaries who had come to Laos way before the war started played a positive role in the war simply by conducting their traditional mission of helping the population. When the war started, they were more necessary than ever for the population. When the Americans came to remote upcountry Laos, they found Father Lucien Bouchard, an American friar of the Catholic Missionary Oblate Order, who lived a life of poverty, walking among villages to help the population, survived communist assassination attempts, attacks by their soldiers with small arms, and living in some of the most remote and unhealthy places on the planet. Once he was walking down a trail where a group of communist soldiers were hiding. As he walked by, one of them aimed his rifle at Father Bouchard to kill him, but another soldier from behind told him not to kill Bouchard because the priest had been coming there to help the soldiers' relatives who had leprosy. War on the ground beginning in the mid-1960s would follow the following pattern. The North Vietnamese would make advances into Laos during the dry season and then fall back to their bases in the wet season when the Lao irregular forces would take the ground back. The rainy season in Laos runs roughly from May until October or so, then the dry season until April. But the Vietnamese were tenacious, and beginning in 1964, they began building a road network to sustain their offenses. This made it possible for the Vietnamese to hold ground during the 1967-68 rainy seasons and to start their annual campaign from a point further west. They also steadily increased their input of troops and heavy weapons until in 1969 and 70 they had 2 divisions deployed. The Lao irregular forces did partake in several offenses in these years, and the Hmong actually retook the Plain of Jars in a major counterattack, but were unable to hold the ground. The regular Lao military was largely ineffective. During the 1970 dry season, the Viets regained all the ground lost in the Plain of Jars area and moved further into Lao-controlled areas than at any time since 1962. The Hmong were depleted as a force at this time because rather than maintaining the original mission of self-defense, they transitioned to a conventional force due to Vang Pao's desires and a U.S. change of mission, which I will talk about. By 1970, Sam Tong had been lost, Long Cheng was being rocketed, and the Hmong were employing boy soldiers. Although Vang Pao and the Hmong retook Sam Tong, the war in Laos had become a lost cause, as the Vietnamese launched another 1971 dry season offensive, this time closer to the Hmong than ever before. The year before, the Thai began to introduce combat troops into Laos, up to 17,000, to try to stem the tide of communist advances. Such large formations of troops presented friendly fire problems from Allied aircraft. So to solve the problem, the CIA recruited approximately 100 or more Thai military-age males, their only requirement being able to speak English, and sent them to a 2-week forward air control school at Udon Thani Air Force Base, Thailand, and then sent them to Laos to coordinate airstrikes. My book, found for free at academia.edu, is the first and only story in English recounting this remarkable saga. I want to distinguish the 2 types of air warfare in Laos. There was strategic level bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail with fast-moving aircraft such as F-4s coming in from Thailand or Navy A-6 intruders from aircraft carriers. Then there was the actual tactical type bombing, originating from typically Vientiane, Long Cheng, or Savannakhet, using the slower T-28s, which were originally trainer aircraft. T-28s would be used to support troops in contact with enemy forces or target smaller enemy tactical formations. Tactical bombing requires observers, called FACs, forward air controllers, either on the ground or in the air to conduct visual reconnaissance, locate targets, coordinate air-to-ground strike operations, and to conduct battle damage assessment. 1963 brought escalations on both sides. Throughout the first half of the year, the Viets deployed an additional 5,000 troops into Laos to conduct border security and to expand operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Fighting also broke out between the Pathet Lao and Cong Le's neutralist forces, with him eventually switching sides to the U.S. In November 1963, the U.S. State Department approved U.S. Ambassador Leonard Unger's request for increased air power to address the aggression. This led to several new covert programs related to air power. Prior to 1964, strikes in Laos were FAC'd by American civilians and CIA case officers in Air America aircraft and self-FAC'd by Lao pilots. In some cases, Air America and Thai T-28 pilots flew in Lao-marked T-28 aircraft. In 1964, one of the new programs was Operation Water Pump, which trained Lao fighter pilots and aircraft mechanics at Udon Thani Air Force Base to sustain and maintain the Lao military fleet. Soon, Hmong began training in the program. Hmong pilots suffered about a 50% casualty rate. Their motto was, quote, "Fly until you die," unquote, because this was a war for their homeland and survival. By 1971, the Lao Air Force had doubled the number of sorties they initially flew. Next was Firefly, where Thai pilots were removed from the Thai Air Force roles for combat duty in Laos. The U.S. paid for this program, transferring funds to Thai Headquarters 333. Thai pilots were under operational control of the U.S. Air Attaché in Vientiane and conducted their first airstrikes in Laos on April 7, 1965. The Vietnamese claimed the Thai pilots were flying AT-6s over the plain of Jars as early as March 1961, and this may well be true. In 1966, Project 404 was created to officially assist the Lao Air Force at a much increased level. The U.S., under the Air Attaché's office in Vientiane, established 5 secret air operations centers located in Pak Se, Long Cheng, Savannakhet, Vientiane, and Luang Prabang to coordinate the air war. U.S. Air Force personnel worked in civilian clothes and were given embassy or USAID cards. The mission of the Operations Center was to assist the targeting effort by identifying enemy targets and to deny targeting in civilian areas. As part of this effort, the U.S. placed, secretly of course, U.S. Air Force combat controllers at remote locations to assist the targeting effort. One was Jack Teague, whose father was a Congressman Olin Teague of Texas' 6th Congressional District. Another new development was that the U.S. Air Force enlisted combat controllers became airborne FACs, flying in Air America or Continental aircraft or helicopters, using the code name Butterfly. Often they would take a Thai interpreter with them to communicate with the Thai and Lao aircraft. In early 1967, the 7th Air Force commander, Lieutenant General William W. Spike Momyer, learned of the use of enlisted non-pilots as FACs, and aghast, he halted the Butterfly program, although it had been very effective. He then initiated one of the more thrilling and poignant air stories of the war, the creation of the Ravens. Initially referred to as the Steve Canyon program, the Ravens were U.S. Air Force fighter pilots who, while in Vietnam, volunteered for a secretive, highly dangerous mission in Laos, flying slow and low Cessna 01 Bird Dog aircraft as airborne forward air controllers to identify North Vietnamese formations in Laos. They flew out of Long Cheng. It was dangerous work, many were killed, and the Ravens flew in civilian clothes without military identification. Regarding strategic bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, by 1968 it was clear to the U.S. Department of Defense that the bombing interdiction campaign along the trail was having no effect. A July 1968 Department of Defense paper concluded, "The U.S. bombing in North Vietnam and Laos has no observable effect upon enemy force or activity levels in South Vietnam. Since 1965, the U.S. air attack sorties against North Vietnam and Laos have increased about fivefold. Over the same period, the main enemy force has increased its strength levels by 75%, its attacks fivefold, and its overall activity ninefold. Yet the U.S. bombing only increased." As you can see, just like the Vietnam War, the Lao War was one of continual escalation. Reviewing the war in total, there had been 4 marked escalations since the Geneva Agreement in 1962 until the war ended. The first was the larger introduction of conventional U.S. ground troops into neighboring Vietnam in 1965. This almost assured the fight in Laos could no longer be fought locally, isolated from the conflict in Vietnam, because the conflict in Vietnam would spill over into Laos. The second was the arrival of a new CIA station chief in Vientiane in June or July 1966, Theodore Shackley, later the Saigon chief of station. Driven by ambition, Shackley was said by many who served with him to be uninterested with the Hmong or Lao welfare and cared little to know about their history or culture. Shackley desired the Hmong to group for regimental-sized operations and was convinced air power would enable the Hmong to defeat the Vietnamese. Both suppositions were deadly wrong. Shackley had put the U.S. mission on a dangerous course that changed the complexion of the Lao operation. Shackley had been roundly criticized by Bill Lair, Vint Lawrence, and other CIA officers and war participants for employing the Hmong beyond their capabilities. The Hmong never could have been expected to attack and hold ground against seasoned North Vietnamese who had defeated the French. The third escalation was Ambassador George Godley replacing Ambassador William Sullivan in 1969. Godley wanted to win the war through aggressive military action. The fourth marked escalatory change was the largest to date Viet offensive during the rainy season of 1969-70. The fight was no longer guerrilla actions or small unit engagements, but large conventional operations, a type of warfare not suited for the Hmong or irregular SGU forces. And we know how this ends. In 1969, President Nixon announced the U.S. policy of Vietnamization. The U.S. would begin drawing down from Southeast Asia. In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending the war. 2 years later, communist forces seized the former Allied capitals of Vientiane, Saigon, and Phnom Penh, placing tyranny upon the populations. Tens of thousands of former soldiers, civil servants, priests, monks, teachers, writers, and others were placed into labor camps, sometimes called seminar camps, serving for years, or even over a decade, while others died from exposure, malnutrition, and illness. The king and queen of Laos died in such a camp, buried in unmarked graves. A portion of the Hmong population had been wiped out, no one really knows what percentage, and unexploded ordnance litters the countryside today, still maiming farmers and children. In the final segment, I'm going to address questions you surely have, such as, how was it that so many Lao civilians suffered from air bombing? Did we intentionally target civilians? I'm going to address the final compelling chapter of the Lao War, the emergency evacuation of the Hmong from Long Cheng in 1975. I have the honor to know and speak with regularly as he lives here in Thailand with Les Strauss, one of the 5 American pilots that flew that 3-day mission to evacuate the Hmong. also the same pilot who flew Pot Buell from Vientiane. And we will see how many Americans remain missing from that conflict. Finally, I will recommend the best books, several are free, on the Lao War for your further reading. Few of these books are comprehensive, and that is good. Each specializes on a specific topic. I make no money on recommending them. I do own all of them, so I can vouch for their integrity. Thank you for joining me for our final session. By this point, you surely have formed some opinions about the war, so now is the right time for the following point. You and I cannot properly evaluate and understand this war without knowing something of the worldview of the native participants based upon their history and experiences. Thailand and Vietnam had been warring for several centuries over Laos to keep the other at bay. The Plain of Jars had been fought over by both. Generations had suffered. In the early 1800s, the Thai sacked Vientiane twice, the second time forcibly removing the population into Thailand and burning the city to the ground, to include every tree. For 30 years afterwards, the Thai conducted a depopulation campaign along the Mekong to keep the Vietnamese out as they were inching towards Thailand. The Vietnamese encroachment upon the Hmong violated their fiercely independent life. They wanted to be free, just as you and I want to be free. Theirs was a struggle for their life. A second point is that China and North Vietnam targeted 4 countries for communist expansion during the Second Indochina War: Cambodia, Laos, South Vietnam, and Thailand. You cannot understand this Lao War without understanding Thailand's fight for its survival. Thailand had a very violent communist insurgency inside Thailand, which it didn't defeat until 1985. So we easily can make judgments about this war, but as filmmaker Ken Burns said when making his film about the Vietnam War, there is no one truth in a war. Now, certainly the U.S. government lying about what it was doing and not having the courage to state with complete conviction the U.S. goal was criminal. And secondly, the absolute too loose, not rigid enough standards in bombing. I personally know scores of Americans who fought in Laos, and I don't know one who doesn't mourn today for the destruction of Laos. Americans on the ground and in the air were trying to do the right thing against the communist enemy who, make no mistake about this, committed innumerable war crimes in its insatiable lust for domination of these foreign countries, and who was determined to conquer Laos and ultimately did. Some estimate the U.S. dropped about 4 billion bombs on Laos. A fourth of Lao territory is littered with unexploded ordnance, as a third of the bombs fell to detonate on impact. Tens of thousands of Lao civilians have been killed or maimed by bombies, as they are called locally. The Lao people have adapted in some surprising ways, transforming shrapnel, shell casings, and unexploded bombs into everything from decorations to boats, spoons, and ladders, as well as creating a thriving but highly dangerous market in scrap metal trade. I have bottle openers the Lao made from such scrap that I brought back from Laos. Children are taught about the deadliness of unexploded ordnance through the bombing song, which most Lao can recite from memory. U.S. officials, I opine based upon my research, attempted in good faith to protect civilians, but one cannot drop such a high volume of bombs and expect civilians to be safe. When the Hmong counterattacked to seize the Plain of Jars in September 1969, with air power supporting, the friendly forces found the towns of Jinguangville, Con Kay, Bon Bon heavily bombed and the inhabitants gone. In January and February 1970, when the Vietnamese attack to recapture the Plain of Jars was imminent, the U.S. evacuated all civilians from the area around the Plain of Jars to Vientiane, thus creating 15,000 to 20,000 refugees. Despite saturation bombing by U.S. B-52s, the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese regained complete control of the plane in March 1970. The U.S. Navy mistakenly bombed one friendly town so often, Ambassador Sullivan wrote in one of his cables, quote, "Tecumseh weeps," unquote, referring to the noted statue at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Another situation where collateral bombings occurred is that sometimes U.S. bombers on a mission over Vietnam could not drop their ordnance. On the return flight over Laos, they had to jettison ordnance because it's too dangerous to land with the munitions. The 5 air operations centers in Laos had designated land areas in Laos that was supposedly uninhabited for the aircraft to drop their ordnance. So many bombs were purposely jettisoned on the return flight back to Thailand. One U.S. Air Force pilot in Laos stated, quote, "The entire air war was run out of the embassy in a little room full of radios. I was looking in there when I first got there, and coming over a radio was a call from a flight of F-4s coming back from bombing in North Vietnam, but I guess they were weathered out and still had ordnance to drop. They were requesting permission to hit a strike area used for this purpose. A 2-stripe enlisted airman was walking by the room at the time, picked up the radio, and authorized the strike," unquote. The U.S. was never going to build a nation in Laos. The Lao government developed no organizational capability for prosecuting the war. The controlling political forces in Laos were regional, just like in Afghanistan, and a central government can take no effective action beyond the capital without the concurrence of local chieftains. Although in control of the government and its military forces, the ethnic Lao comprise less than half the population. The elite of this Lao minority is a collection of rival clans who share little sense of national purpose, but regard the government and the public service as an arena where they competed for influence and power to enrich themselves. Next, when the war ended in 1975 with a communist victory, the communist Lao government did not repatriate any U.S. prisoners of war. U.S. teams still conduct digs in Laos to repatriate American remains, and they bring doctors with them to help the local population. As one example, Jean de Bruin, working for Air America delivering rice, was shot down over Laos in 1963 and parachuted from the flaming Air America C-46. He became a Pathet Lao prisoner of war for 3 years, and then with several others conducted the largest prison camp break of the Second Indochina War. The prisoners separated into groups after the escape. A few were rescued, perhaps the most famous being Navy Lieutenant Dieter Dengler, who later wrote a book about his experiences, which was turned into a movie, Rescue Dawn. Sadly, Jean de Bruin remains missing in action. Also, because the war was secret, there were an unknown number of American servicemen who were killed in combat in Laos, mainly the Special Operations Group soldiers conducting raids from Vietnam, but whose military records state killed in Vietnam. I believe the evidence strongly indicates that many Americans were left behind in Laos. The CIA was so convinced it sent a clandestine reconnaissance force into Laos in 1981 to try to recover Americans. The problem with this issue is several crazies in the 1980s wanted to rescue prisoners of war, jumped into the mix, and their lack of credibility and unfounded claims have discredited the reputable evidence that does exist for POWs. Let's turn to the Hmong evacuation. Brigadier General Harry C. Heine Adderholt from Thailand cobbled together an air evacuation fleet, and between May 10 and May 14, 1975, using U.S. C-130s and C-46s, airlifted several thousand Hmong from Long Chang to Thailand. After the communist takeover, millions of refugees fled Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam to escape communist rule, many coming to Thailand, which created a crisis. McAllen Thompson was a U.S. government refugee worker in Thailand. He had been stationed in Laos 9 years during the war doing refugee relief. He and Lionel Rosenblatt in Thailand, working with refugees after the war, conducted an internal campaign to move many Hmong to America, and it succeeded. Mac also started a Lao Rural School Assistance Program in 2007, lasting until his death in 2018, which assisted rural Lao schools with floors, ceilings, new bathrooms, and such. The Hmong in America has been a great success story. They have become lawyers, doctors, judges, elected officials, and university professors. Almost 80% live in 3 states. The largest population is in California, followed by Minnesota and Wisconsin. Sunisa Lee, our proud gold medalist, is a Hmong American whose story starts with the American effort in Laos. Finally, I'm going to scroll some books I recommend for further reading. Roger Warner's Shooting at the Moon is an authorized account from Bill Lair and Vint Lawrence and is very well written. The Ravens by Christopher Robbins. The book on the Samtong nurses is free and can be found at the Air America Facebook page. Joe Selesky's Special Air Warfare and the Secret War in Laos is a free download, and what makes it special is that the participants in the war contributed to the book. My book on the Thai Forward Air Guides, as I talked earlier, is free, and I go into some detail on the history of Laos and conflict between Thai and Vietnamese. A shorter article version was published in the CIA's Journal of Intelligence Studies, which you can also download on my page. The Making of the Hmong in America is such a wonderful book on how the Hmong have become outstanding Americans who love this country. Terrence Burke has his account of his time in Laos, as does Thomas Leo Briggs. Shadow War by Kenneth Conboy. A personal favorite of mine is the Dr. Weldon book. I think it touches most closely to the personal side of the war, and his view as a medical doctor is unique. Refugee Workers in the Indochina Exodus is a poignant book covering the refugee crisis after the war, and particularly noteworthy is Chapter 4, The Hmong Escape Laos. Tim Castle has a compelling book on a story I did not cover here, Our Loss of Americans on a Remote Radar Site in Laos. Finally, this Norma Hanna book helps make sense of some of the madness of U.S. policy. I really found the book helpful. For a very in-depth coverage of the war, the CIA's declassified report, Undercover Armies, which you can find free online, is very helpful. There are several YouTube videos on the Lao War. Several are really good, but many have inconsistencies and downright errors, possibly because some people try to push a political narrative. Certainly videos are free, but I highly recommend you stick with some of the sources I have provided you, at least to begin. In that vein, there is only one book on the war I don't recommend. Joshua Kurlantz's A Great Place to Have a War. In my opinion, when accurate, it is largely a regurgitation of the original books I have provided here. But otherwise, I found the book riddled with errors, inaccuracies, and misjudgments. Well, I hope that I have helped you understand the war a bit better, and I earnestly appreciate you watching. Obviously, such a short time can only cover the highlights and basic outline of the war, but now you have some basic understanding and background and can do further reading and viewing. Thank you so much for watching, and please feel free to email me at varanyapub@gmail.com.